Rain smeared the glass of the corner office, warping the city lights into bleeding streaks of neon. Lewis didn't care about the view. He cared about the slight, almost imperceptible hitch in his assistant's breath when her phone buzzed. Corinne was meticulous, unflappable. But for 3 weeks, she'd been jumping at shadows, hiding bruised wrists under cheap silk blouses. Tonight, her ex-boyfriend made the fatal mistake of cornering her in the lobby. He thought she was alone. She wasn't. Tension in the Butler syndicate rarely announced itself with gunfire. It usually started with silence. Lewis Butler sat behind a desk of reclaimed mahogany. A fortress of a man in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, watching the woman across the room, Corinne Harris. For 2 years, she had been the only indispensable moving part in his entire operation. She managed his legitimate shell corporations, filtered his encrypted communications, and remembered that he took his coffee black, poured only after the water had cooled for exactly 40 seconds. She was brilliant. She was quiet. And this morning, she was lying to him. The quarterly reports from the docks, Corinne said, her voice even. She placed a pristine manila folder on the edge of his desk. Revenue is down 4%. Customs is holding 3 containers. I've already drafted the necessary greasing protocols for the Port Authority. Leave it, Louis murmured. He didn't look at the folder. He looked at her hand. Corinne pulled her arm back, a fraction of a second too fast. She gripped the edge of her tablet, her knuckles white. She was wearing a high-necked, long-sleeved silk blouse. It was July. The air conditioning in the high-rise was aggressive, but not enough to warrant the thick, opaque tights she wore under her pencil skirt. Louis leaned back in his leather chair. He was a man who lived and breathed details. He noticed when a rival boss changed his security detail. He noticed when a shipment weighed 10 pounds less than manifested. And he noticed that Corinne, who usually wore barely there tinted moisturizer, had spackled high-coverage matte concealer over her left jawline. The color match was close, but the office lighting was unforgiving, and the slight yellowish ring bleeding through the makeup was unmistakable, a bruise in its final fading stages. "You're late," Louis said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a tactical probe. Corinne was never late. In 24 months, she had beaten him to the office 730 times. Today, she had arrived 12 minutes after him. Corinne swallowed. The tendon in her neck jumped. Traffic on the bridge. An accident. I apologize, Mr. Butler. It won't happen again. Traffic. Lewis repeated the word slowly, letting it hang in the sterile air of the office. He knew the traffic patterns of the city better than the civil engineers who designed them. There had been no accident on the bridge. Yes. She didn't meet his eyes. That was the second tell. Corinne stared down hardened union bosses and corrupt city aldermen on a weekly basis without blinking. Now she was staring at the carpet. Look at me, Corinne. The command was soft. Louis never yelled. Volume was for men who lacked authority. She raised her chin. Her eyes, usually sharp and clear, were glassed over with a bone-deep exhaustion. Shadows clung to the skin beneath her lower lashes. She looked like a woman treading water in a storm, moments away from letting the current take her. "Are you sleeping?" he asked. "Perfectly fine." Your typing speed is down. You usually average 90 words a minute. Today, I could hear the hesitation between the keystrokes. You dropped a coffee stirrer in the break room and flinched as if a gun went off. Lewis leaned forward, resting his forearms on the desk. Who is he? Corinne froze. The professional mask she wore, the one that made her the perfect, unreadable assistant, shattered for a microscopic second. Pure, unadulterated panic flashed across her face. I don't know what you're talking about, she whispered. A woman doesn't wear a turtleneck in 90-degree weather unless she's hiding a hickey or a handprint, Lewis said, his voice dropping an octave, flattening into something cold and dangerous. And given the way you favor your left ribs when you reach for a file, I'm guessing it's not a hickey. So I will ask you one more time. Who is he? Corinne took a step backward. It was an instinctual retreat. It's personal. It doesn't affect my work. You were 12 minutes late. It affects your work. I handled it. She snapped, a sudden flare of desperate anger breaking through her terror. She pressed her lips together, instantly regretting the outburst. I handled it, Lewis. Please, just let it go. She had his first name. She only did that when the building was literally on fire or when the police were at the front doors. Lewis stared at her for a long, heavy moment. He saw the frantic pulse beating at the base of her throat. He saw the rigid set of her shoulders. She was terrified. Not of him, of whatever was waiting for her outside this building. He felt a slow, dark pressure building in his chest, a territorial violence he usually reserved for his worst enemies. Corinne was his. Not in a romantic sense. At least he had never allowed himself to entertain the thought. But she belonged to his world. She was under his roof, his protection. Someone had put their hands on his property. Someone had made his assistant flinch. Fine, Lewis said smoothly. He picked up a silver pen and turned his attention to the manila folder. If you've handled it, we'll leave it. Get me the mayor's chief of staff on the line. Corinne exhaled a shaky, relieved breath. Right away. She turned and walked out of the office, closing the heavy oak door behind her. Lewis waited exactly 5 seconds. He put the pen down. He picked up his secure cell phone and dialed a number. Tommy? Lewis said when the line connected. Corinne Harris. I want to know where she goes, who she talks to, and who she lives with. Pull her apartment security feeds. Tap her personal cell. You think she's a rat boss? Tommy asked, his voice rough with suspicion. No, Lewis said, looking at the spot on the carpet where Corinne had just been standing. I think someone is hunting her. Find out who. And Tommy, put a detail on her. If anyone gets within 10 feet of her without her permission, break their legs. He hung up the phone. The office was quiet again, but the silence had changed. It was no longer peaceful. It was the silence of a hammer being pulled back. By Wednesday, Louis knew everything. He sat in his dark, minimalist apartment overlooking the skyline. A tumbler of amber liquid sweating onto the glass table. Spread out before him were high-resolution photographs, financial statements, and a rap sheet. Dawson Palmer, 32 years old, mid-level regional sales manager for a failing pharmaceutical distributor, gambler, narcissist, weak. Louis picked up a photograph taken from a telephoto lens outside Corinne's apartment building. It showed Dawson grabbing Corinne by the upper arm, his face twisted in a snarl. Corinne was looking away, her posture defensive, defeated. Louis's jaw tightened. The glass in his hand groaned under the pressure of his grip. Tommy had delivered the brief an hour ago. Dawson Palmer was a cliché. A man who lost at the poker tables and went home to win against a woman who was smaller than him. They had broken up 3 months ago. Corinne had moved out, changed her number, and tried to disappear into her work. But Palmer had tracked her down. He had been waiting outside her apartment, calling her office from blocked numbers, threatening to tell her conservative family back in Ohio that she was working for a known crime syndicate if she didn't pay off his debts. He was using Louis's reputation to blackmail Corinne. Louis took a slow sip of the whiskey. It tasted like ash. He could have Dawson Palmer killed. It would take one text message. The man would disappear into the foundation of a new high-rise in Queens, and Corinne would be free. But Corinne wasn't stupid. She would know. And despite the bruised ribs and the terror, Corinne wasn't a killer. She would carry the guilt of his murder. She would look at Louis and see a monster, not a savior. No. Death was too easy for Dawson Palmer, and it was too messy for Corinne. Louis needed to break the man systematically. He needed to make Dawson Palmer run. Thursday morning, the atmosphere in the office was suffocating. Corinne was pale. She had dropped a stack of shipping manifests twice. Her phone sat on her desk, face down, silent. But she kept casting terrified glances at it, as if it were a bomb ticking down to 0. Louis watched her from his glass-walled office. He had a meeting with the heads of the 5 families in 3 hours. He was supposed to be reviewing territorial concessions. Instead, he was watching Corinne try to breathe. At 11:45 a.m., her desk phone rang, the direct external line. Louis saw her jump. She stared at the flashing red light. She didn't reach for it. It rang twice. 3 times. Louis stood up, walked out of his office and crossed the bullpen. He stood behind her chair. Corinne was frozen, her hands hovering over the keyboard. "Answer it," Louis said quietly. Corinne flinched. It's probably Stan." "Answer it, Corinne." She picked up the receiver with a trembling hand. "Mr. Butler's office," Corinne speaking. Silence on the other end. Then a tinny, aggressive voice leaked through the earpiece. Louis was close enough to hear the cadence, if not the exact words. It was male. It was angry. Corinne closed her eyes. "Dawson, I told you not to call me here. You think you can just ignore me? You stuck up." The voice was louder now, slurred, riding the edge of chemically induced confidence. "I need $5,000 by tonight, or I walk into that lobby and tell your mafia boss exactly what kind of corporate espionage you've been doing for me." It was a bluff, a pathetic, hollow bluff. Corinne hadn't leaked a single comma of Louis's business. But Dawson knew she was terrified of Louis. He was using her fear of the devil to extort her. Corinne's voice cracked. "I don't have it. I gave you everything I had last week. Please, Dawson. I'll lose my job. I'm coming down there. 6 p.m. You better be in the parking garage with the cash, or I'm coming up to the top floor." The line clicked dead. Corinne slowly lowered the receiver. A tear slipped down her cheek, ruining the careful makeup she had applied over her bruises. She quickly wiped it away, sniffing hard. I need to leave early today, she said to her monitor, not looking at Louis. A personal matter? No, Louis said. Corinne spun around in her chair, her eyes wide with desperation. Louis, please. You don't understand. If I don't go, I understand perfectly. Louis placed his large, calloused hand on the back of her chair. He didn't touch her. He just anchored her space. You are not leaving this building. You are going to sit here, and you are going to finish the quarterly reports. At 6 p.m., you will go down to the garage. He'll hurt me. She whispered the confession tearing out of her. It was the first time she had admitted it out loud. The shame in her eyes was agonizing. He's crazy, Louis. You don't know him. I know exactly who he is, Louis said smoothly. Dawson Palmer, 50,000 in debt to a bookie named Sal out of Newark. Snorts cheap cocaine. Drives a leased BMW he can't afford. Likes to hit women who are smaller than him. Corinne stopped breathing. She stared at him, the color draining completely from her face. How? You work for me, Corinne. Did you honestly think I wouldn't notice a predator circling my territory? Louis's voice was a low rumble. You don't need to find $5,000. You just need to go to the garage at 6 p.m. I will handle the rest. Louis, no. He'll go to the police. He'll say you, let me worry about what he says. Louis straightened up. He adjusted his cuffs, his face an unreadable mask of cold stone. Finish the reports, Corinne. He walked back into his office. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He had laid the trap. Now he just had to wait for the rat to walk into it. The underground parking garage of the Butler building was a cavern of poured concrete, flickering fluorescent lights, and the heavy smell of exhaust. At 6:15 p.m., it was mostly deserted. The legitimate employees had gone home. Only the shadows remained. Corinne stood by her modest sedan, her arms wrapped around her waist. She was shivering despite the humid summer air trapped in the basement. Every echo of a tire, every drip of condensation from the pipes made her flinch. Footfalls echoed from the ramp. Heavy, erratic. Dawson emerged from the gloom. He looked exactly as the file described, handsome in a weak, decaying way. His suit was wrinkled, his pupils blown wide. He walked with the swagger of a man who thought fear was respect. You're late, Dawson snapped, closing the distance between them. Corinne backed up against the door of her car. I don't have the money, Dawson. I'm done. You have to leave me alone. Dawson laughed. It was an ugly, grating sound. You're done when I say you're done, Corinne. He lunged forward, grabbing her by the collar of her silk blouse, twisting the fabric so tight it choked her. You think because you work in a fancy building, you're better than me? I own you. You're going to go upstairs, steal whatever cash is in petty cash, or I swear to God, I will break your jaw. Corinne gasped for air, her hands coming up to pry his fingers away. Let go. I'll let go when I have my money. Dawson raised his other hand, curling it into a fist. I suggest you remove your hand from my wife. The voice didn't echo. It cut through the damp air like a straight razor. Dawson froze. He turned his head, still keeping his grip on Corinne. Louis Butler stepped out from the shadows of a concrete pillar. He had taken off his suit jacket. His white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar. His sleeves rolled up to the elbows, revealing the dark ink of syndicate tattoos winding up his forearms. He didn't look angry. He looked entirely terrifyingly bored. "Who the hell are you?" Dawson sneered, though his voice wavered. "I'm the man who owns the building you are trespassing in," Lewis said, walking forward. His pace was slow, measured, the gait of an apex predator. "I am the man who owns the $50,000 markers you owe to Sal in Newark, and as of an hour ago, I am the man married to the woman you are currently touching." Corin stared at Lewis, her vision swimming. "Wife!" Dawson scoffed, trying to mask his rising panic with bravado. "Wife? You're full of she's my girl. She's a cheap little secretary who—" Lewis didn't run. He didn't. He simply arrived. In one fluid motion, Louis grabbed Dawson's wrist, the one holding Corinne, and twisted it. A wet, sickening crack echoed through the garage. Dawson shrieked, instantly releasing Corinne. He dropped to his knees, clutching his mangled arm. "My wrist! You broke my wrist!" Corinne stumbled back, gasping, pressing her hands to her throat. Louis stepped between her and Dawson, blocking her from the pathetic sight of the man on the floor. "I broke your scaphoid bone," Lewis corrected, clinically, looking down at Dawson, as one might look at a smear of dog on an expensive shoe. "It requires surgery to heal correctly. Surgery you cannot afford, because as of this afternoon, your bank accounts are frozen." Dawson looked up his face, pale sweat beading on his forehead. "What? You can't do that." "I own Sal's book," Louis continued, ignoring the whimpering, "which means you owe me $50,000. With interest, let's call it 70. You don't have 70? You don't have 7? So here is the new arrangement." Louis crouched down, balancing effortlessly on the balls of his feet. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, dropping it on the concrete in front of Dawson. "That is a one-way bus ticket to Anchorage, Alaska," Louis said softly. "You will get on that bus tonight. You will never contact Corinne again. You will never set foot in the tri-state area again. If you do, I won't break your wrist. I will feed you to the stray dogs in the junkyard down by the port. Nod, if you understand." Dawson stared at the ticket, then at Louis's dead black eyes. He nodded frantically, cradling his broken arm against his chest. "I understand. I'm going. Good." Louis stood up. "Get out of my sight before I change my mind." Dawson scrambled to his feet, crying openly now, and stumbled toward the exit ramp, leaving the ticket on the ground. He didn't look back. He ran until the sound of his ragged breathing faded into the hum of the city above. The garage fell silent again. Louis turned around. Corinne was still pressed against her car, shaking violently. The adrenaline was leaving her system, leaving behind a cold, crushing shock. Louis didn't crowd her. He stopped 3 feet away. He took a clean, pressed handkerchief from his pocket and held it out. Corinne stared at it, then up at his face. "Wife," she stammered, her voice raspy. Why did you say that he needed to believe that his leverage was gone?" Louis said smoothly, his tone returning to the calm, detached cadence of the boardroom. "A man like Palmer only respects ownership. By claiming you as mine, as family, I removed you from his playing field. He won't come back. The syndicate rules are absolute. You touch a boss's wife, you die. He knows that." Corinne took the handkerchief, clutching it in her trembling hands. "You bought his debt. A minor expense. You broke his wrist. A minor exertion. Corinne let out a choked sound, a cross between a sob and a laugh. I don't know how to repay you. The 50,000, I can work overtime. I can, Corinne. Louis stepped closer, just an inch. You owe me nothing. You are the best assistant I have ever had. My business functions because you function. Consider it a bonus. He looked at the angry red marks blossoming on her neck, where Dawson had twisted the silk. The cold, logical part of Louis's brain told him to step back, to keep the professional distance he had maintained for 2 years. But the darker, obsessive part, the part that had watched her for months, memorizing her habits, protecting her from the shadows, refused to yield, slowly giving her every opportunity to pull away. Louis reached out. His large, rough hand brushed against her collarbone. His thumb gently traced the edge of the bruised skin. Corinne froze, her breath catching. She didn't pull away. She looked up at him, her eyes wide, searching his face. You're safe now, Louis murmured, his voice dropping into a dark, intimate register that sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with fear. He's gone. You will go home. You will sleep. And tomorrow you will come to work. And you will never wear a turtleneck in July again. He dropped his hand. He turned and began walking back toward the private elevator. Louis, Corinne called out, her voice echoing slightly in the vast space. He stopped, glancing over his shoulder. Thank you, she whispered. Louis didn't smile. He simply gave a single, tight nod. I'll see you tomorrow, Mrs. Butler. The elevator doors opened, swallowing him whole, leaving Corinne alone in the quiet, safe, dark, Part 4. The Lie We Live. Gossip in the Butler Syndicate moved faster than wired money. By Friday morning, the word wife had metastasized from the damp basement garage to the upper echelons of the organization. Corinne felt the weight of it the moment she stepped out of the private elevator. The security guards didn't just nod. They stood straighter, their hands resting closer to their shoulder holsters. The underbosses, waiting in the expensive lobby, lowered their eyes, abruptly stopping their hushed conversations. She was no longer just the gatekeeper who managed the boss's schedule. She was the queen on the board. Louis didn't explain it to his lieutenants. He didn't retract the statement. He simply let the lie harden into concrete. Corinne confronted him at precisely 10 o'clock in the morning. She placed his espresso on the desk, waiting until the steam curled past his sharp jawline. People are staring, more than usual. People always stare at you, Corinne, Louis replied, not looking up from a leather-bound ledger. You're a striking woman. They would be blind not to. They are staring because they think I am married to you. She crossed her arms. Her neck was bare today. A silk scarf she usually used to hide her bruises was tied loosely around the handle of her handbag, discarded. A capo from the Lower East Side brought a wedding gift to my desk. It's a commercial-grade silver espresso machine. It weighs 40 pounds and came with a card written in blood-red ink wishing us a fertile union. Keep it. Your apartment coffee is terrible, and you need the caffeine. Louis. She pressed her palms flat against his mahogany desk, forcing him to acknowledge her. You told Dawson that to scare him. He's gone. He took the bus to Anchorage. You don't have to keep up the charade with your own men. Louis finally looked up. his dark, impenetrable eyes locked onto hers, stripping away the exasperation she tried to project. "Dawson is a symptom," he said, his voice dropping to that lethal quiet register that commanded empires. He was weak, a bottom feeder. But word gets out that a woman associated with me was vulnerable, that she could be touched, bruised, manipulated. That makes you a target for men far more dangerous than a cooked-up pharmaceutical rep. The men in this building, my men, my rivals, are loyal to strength. If they think you are simply my assistant, they will eventually test my authority over you to find a weak point. If they think you are my wife, they will slaughter anyone who looks at you wrong. It elevates you from collateral to royalty. He leaned back, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored shirt. The lie stays. It is a titanium shield. Put it on and wear it. She didn't argue. She couldn't. Not when the memory of Dawson's grip was still an echo shivering on her skin. But the shield came with conditions she hadn't anticipated. Friday evening, Tommy appeared at Corinne's desk with 2 large, heavy-duty duffel bags. "Boss says it's time to pack." Tommy grunted, actively avoiding her gaze. He looked distinctly uncomfortable, shifting his weight like a man asked to handle armed explosives. Corinne frowned, her fingers hovering over her keyboard. Pack for what? A business trip? He didn't mention Montreal. For the move. Tommy scratched the back of his thick neck. Married couples don't live in separate boroughs, Miss Harris. I mean, Mrs. Buck, sir. Ma'am? He cleared his throat, looking thoroughly miserable. Car's downstairs. He gave me an hour to clear out your bathroom and closet. She marched into Louis's office, bypassing the intercom entirely. He was on the phone, speaking rapid, fluent Italian to a supplier in Palermo. He saw her furious face, held up a single finger, demanding a pause, and finished the call with a curt command. "I am not moving into your apartment," she stated, her voice trembling with indignation. "It's a penthouse," Louis corrected, smoothly placing the receiver down. "It has 5 bedrooms. You will have the entire east wing. It has its own entrance, its own climate control, and glass that can stop a .50 caliber sniper round. Your current apartment has a rusted fire escape and a deadbolt that I picked with a standard paperclip when I did my security sweep on Tuesday." Corinne's breath hitched. The indignation vanished, replaced by a chilling realization. "You broke into my apartment. I secured my investment. I am a person, Louis, not an asset. You are both, and right now you are a massive liability. If you are sitting alone in a studio apartment in Brooklyn, while the entire 5 boroughs thinks you share my bed and my secrets," he stood up, towering over her. The spatial dominance wasn't a threat. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket. "Bring your clothes. Bring your books. I don't care about the cheap IKEA furniture. We leave in 10 minutes. Tommy will burn the rest." The penthouse was a monument to cold, aggressive wealth. Polished slate floors, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering, sprawling grid of Manhattan, and an absolute absence of personal warmth. There were no photographs, no art that looked like it had been chosen for love rather than investment. Corinne dropped her bags in the cavernous foyer. The silence of the massive space was deafening, pressing against her eardrums. Louis walked past her, shrugging off his suit jacket and pouring 2 glasses of water from a black marble island in the kitchen. He handed her one. Their fingers brushed. A sharp, static shock snapped between them loud in the quiet room. "Your room is down the hall, last door on the right," he said, his voice slightly tighter than usual, his eyes lingering on the spot where their skin had connected. Corin took a sip of the water. It was ice cold, grounding her. "How long does this last, Louis?" "This marriage?" Louis looked out at the city. The neon lights reflected in his eyes, making them look like fractured obsidian. "Until I say it's over?" He walked away, retreating to his own wing, leaving her in the center of his fortress. Corin realized then, with a slow, creeping certainty that settled deep in her marrow, that Dawson Palmer had never been her true cage. Dawson was just a rat in the walls. She had traded him for a dragon. And the terrifying, unspoken truth was she didn't want the dragon to let her go. Part 5. Silk and Kevlar. 4 excruciating weeks passed in a state of suspended animation. They lived like ghosts, haunting the same sprawling mausoleum. Corin brewed his coffee in the morning, leaving it exactly 40 seconds to cool. They rode in the armored SUV in heavy silence, separated by the leather armrest. They worked side by side for 12 hours a day, ruthlessly destroying rival supply chains and laundering millions through legitimate shell logistics companies, only to return to the penthouse and retreat to their separate soundproofed wings. But the physical proximity with was doing terrible corrosive things to Louis's legendary restraint. He smelled the ghost of her vanilla and bergamot shampoo lingering in the hallway hours after she left for work. He saw the damp, delicate imprints of her bare feet on the slate tile near the indoor pool on Sunday mornings. He heard the soft, rhythmic sound of her turning pages in a paperback thriller late at night, when the city below was quiet. He was a man accustomed to taking exactly what he wanted, conquering territories through sheer force of will, and yet he was deliberately starving himself mere inches from a feast. The breaking point arrived in the form of a heft gold-embossed envelope. The annual Castellano Charity Gala, a mandated gathering of the Northeastern syndicates thinly veiled as a philanthropic fundraiser for an orphanage no one cared about. It was neutral ground, highly scrutinized, heavily armed, and absolutely mandatory for bosses. Louis found Corin in the kitchen on a Tuesday night. She was wearing an oversized grey cashmere sweater that fell off one shoulder, her reading glasses slipping down her nose as she reviewed a quarterly projection report on her tablet. She looked soft, accessible. It made his jaw clench. Thursday night, the Castellano Gala, Louis said, dropping the heavy invitation onto the marble counter with a sharp clack. "We're going." Corin looked at the card, pushing her glasses up. "I'll coordinate your schedule." "Do you need Tommy to drive the decoy car?" "No." Louis placed both hands on the marble counter, leaning his imposing frame into her space. He trapped her between his arms, though he didn't touch her. "I need you to wear a ring." Corin froze. The tablet slipped from her fingers, clattering softly against the counter. She stared up at him. "What?" Louis reached into his tailored slacks and produced a small, worn velvet box. He didn't open it. He slid it across the marble, until it bumped gently against her ceramic coffee mug. "If you show up to a syndicate gala on my arm without a ring, it insults the intelligence of every boss in that ballroom. They will think I am keeping a mistress and calling her a wife just to protect her from collateral damage. A mistress is fair game for their disrespect. A wife is untouchable. You need to look untouchable." Corinne stared at the black box. Her heart hammered wildly against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. She reached out with trembling, hesitant fingers and flipped the lid. It was a flawless, emerald-cut diamond, 3 carats at least, flanked by tapered baguettes, set in heavy platinum. Cold, heavy, utterly perfect. It wasn't gaudy. It was a statement of undisputed ownership and lethal wealth. "Put it on," Lewis murmured, his eyes tracking the pulse beating rapidly at the base of her throat. She slipped it onto her left ring finger. It slid over her knuckles smoothly. It fit perfectly. He hadn't asked her ring size. He had noticed. Of course he had. "Thursday," Louis repeated, his eyes dropping to her parted lips for a fraction of a second before he pushed off the counter and retreated from the kitchen, leaving all the oxygen sucked out of the room. Thursday night, the penthouse felt like a war room preparing for a siege. Corinne stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror in her bedroom suite. She had chosen a backless midnight blue silk gown that poured over her body like water. It clung to her curves, severe and elegant, offering no apologies. Her hair was pinned up in a complex twist, exposing the pale, smooth skin of her neck and back skin that was completely healed, unblemished, definitively free of Dawson's violent ghost. A soft, authoritative knock sounded at the door. "Come in," she called out, her voice betraying a slight tremor. Lewis stepped into the room. He was wearing a bespoke black tuxedo that fit him like armor. The sharp, elegant lines of the suit contrasted violently with the brutal, contained energy he carried beneath it. He stopped dead in his tracks when he saw her. The air in the room seemed to vanish instantly. Corinne turned slowly to face him, her hand smoothing the silk at her hips. "Is this acceptable for the Castellanos?" Louis didn't answer immediately. He closed the distance between them with slow, deliberate steps, his eyes dark and entirely predatory. He stopped a breath away, so close she could smell his cologne, sandalwood, and gunpowder. "Turn around." She obeyed, her heart lodging firmly in her throat. He stood behind her, looking at their shared reflection in the mirror. His massive frame shadowed hers, completely engulfing her silhouette. Slowly, he reached into his inner jacket pocket and pulled out a heavy, glittering diamond tennis necklace. "Lift your hair," he commanded softly, the gravel in his voice more pronounced than usual. Corinne gathered the stray wisps of her pinned hair, exposing the sensitive nape of her neck. Louis's warm, calloused fingers brushed against her skin as he draped the freezing, cold diamonds around her throat. A violent shiver racked her frame. He noticed. He always noticed everything about her. He fastened the intricate clasp, but he didn't pull his hands away. He rested his heavy palms on her bare shoulders, his thumbs slowly stroking the delicate ridge of her collarbone. The contrast of his dark, tattooed skin against her pale perfection was stark in the mirror. "You look," Louis started, his voice thick, struggling against the leash he kept on his own desires. He stopped, swallowing hard. "You look exactly like what you are." "And what is that?" Corinne whispered to his reflection, her eyes dilated, locked onto his dark gaze in the glass. "Mine." The word wasn't a corporate designation. It wasn't a protective lie constructed for the syndicate's benefit. It was a raw, primal confession of absolute truth. Louis's hands slid down her bare arms, his touch leaving a trail of fire until they rested firmly on her waist. He pulled her backward, flush against his chest. Corinne gasped softly, her eyes fluttering shut as the solid, immovable wall of his body aligned perfectly with hers. She could feel the steady, heavy beat of his heart through the layers of her silk and his wool. "Louis," she breathed, leaning her head back against his shoulder. "Tonight," he whispered, lowering his head until his lips brushed the delicate shell of her ear, sending another wave of heat straight to her core. "You are going to walk into a room full of wolves. They are going to look at you. They are going to want you because you belong to me. And you are going to look only at me. Do you understand?" "Yes," she said, leaning back further into his heat, surrendering entirely to the gravitational pull of him. "Good." He kissed the sensitive skin just below her earlobe, a searing, branding touch that made her knees instantly weak. "Let's go show them exactly who you belong to." Chandeliers hung like frozen tears from the vaulted ceiling of the Plaza Ballroom, casting fractured light over a sea of tailored velvet and ruthless ambition. The Castellano Charity Gala was less a fundraiser and more a heavily armed networking event. Every man in the room was a killer, every woman on their arms an accomplice. Corinne felt the shift in atmospheric pressure the second she and Louis stepped past the gilded double doors. Conversations didn't stop, but they muted. Eyes tracked them, calculating, assessing, weighing the validity of the rumors that had torn through the underworld. Louis didn't alter his stride. He moved through the crowd like an icebreaker, navigating a frozen sea, charting a direct course for the center of the room. He kept his hand firmly on the bare lower curve of Corinne's spine. The heat of his palm seared through her skin, a constant grounding anchor in a room full of sharks. "Smile, Corinne," Louis murmured, his lips barely moving as he nodded to a captain from the Genovese outfit. "You look like you're walking to the gallows. I'm calculating the combined prison sentences in this room." She whispered back, keeping her expression perfectly serene, offering a polite, empty smile to a passing waiter. "It's distracting." A low rumble of genuine amusement vibrated in Louis's chest. He pulled her a fraction of an inch closer. They ran the gauntlet for an hour. Corinne played her part with terrifying efficiency. She remembered the names of wives, the ages of grandchildren, and the exact offshore accounts, holding the assets of the men who came to kiss Louis's ring. She wasn't just a beautiful distraction. She was a terrifyingly competent partner. She watched the realization dawn in the eyes of Louis's lieutenants. They had respected her as an assistant, but as a wife, she was a strategic nightmare for their enemies. Then the crowd parted for Damien Costa. Damien was the head of the rival Costa syndicate, controlling the lucrative port smuggling routes that Louis had been slowly choking out for 18 months. He was 10 years older than Louis, with silver threading his dark hair and a charming, practiced smile that didn't quite reach his dead reptilian eyes. "Louis," Damien said, extending a hand adorned with a heavy gold signet ring. "I was beginning to think the rumors were just your men spinning fairy tales. You actually settled down." Louis shook the hand briefly, his grip a fraction tighter than polite. "Damien, I see you're still wearing last year's tailoring." Damien chuckled a dry, humorless sound and turned his predatory gaze to Corinne. His eyes dropped to the 3-carat diamond on her left hand, then trailed slowly, insolently, up the plunging neckline of her silk gown. It was a deliberate, calculated insult, a test to see how tight Louis's leash really was. "And this must be the lovely bride," Damien purred, stepping too close. "Corinne, isn't it? I understand you used to fetch his coffee. Quite a promotion." Louis's hand on Corinne's spine turned to iron. The air around them dropped 10 degrees. Corinne could feel the violence radiating off Louis in waves, a coiled spring seconds away from snapping Damien's neck in front of 300 witnesses. She didn't wait for Louis to start a war. Corinne smiled. It was a perfectly executed, chilling replication of Louis's own boardroom smirk. "I still manage his liquid assets, Mr. Costa," Corinne said, her voice smooth and carrying perfectly over the hum of the ballroom. "Which is why I found it so fascinating that your import revenues from the Brooklyn docks dropped 22% last quarter. It seems your customs agents are experiencing a sudden lapse in loyalty." The silence that fell over their small circle was absolute. Damien's charming smile fractured his eyes, snapping to hers with sudden, venomous clarity. She had just publicly humiliated him using classified financial intel that a mere coffee girl would never possess. She wasn't just wearing Louis's ring. She was wielding his power. "My business is perfectly fine, Mrs. Butler," Damien said, his voice a dangerous hiss. "I'm glad to hear it," Corinne replied sweetly, "because replacing those intercepted shipments of counterfeit pharmaceuticals must be terribly expensive. Enjoy the champagne. I believe it's domestic." She turned, slightly dismissing him entirely, and looked up at Louis. Louis was staring at her. The lethal rage that had been building in his eyes was gone, replaced by a dark, consuming hunger that made her breath catch. He didn't look at Damien. He didn't need to. Corinne had gutted the man without spilling a drop of blood. "Excuse us, Damien," Louis said softly, his eyes never leaving Corinne's. "My wife requires my attention." He didn't wait for a response. Louis guided her away from the sputtering syndicate boss, weaving through the crowd until they reached a secluded alcove near the velvet-draped balcony doors. He backed her into the heavy fabric, shielding her from the room. "You," Louis breathed, resting his forearms against the wall on either side of her head, caging her in. "Are a menace. He insulted you," Corinne said, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The adrenaline was a narcotic in her veins, making her bold. "I don't tolerate disrespect toward my employer. I am not your employer tonight," Louis corrected, his voice dropping into that dark, intimate register that ruined her sleep. He leaned in, his nose brushing the side of her neck, inhaling deeply. "And you didn't do that for the Butler Syndicate. You did it because you know exactly how to use the weapons I give you. Corin swallowed hard, closing her eyes as his warm breath ghosted over her collarbone. Is that a problem? The only problem, Corinne, he murmured, his lips tracing the jawline where Dawson's bruise had once bloomed, is that we are currently in a public venue, and there are 300 people stopping me from showing you exactly how proud I am. Adrenaline leaves a metallic taste in the mouth. It also strips away the polite fictions people use to survive their daily lives. The ride back to the penthouse in the armored SUV was suffocating. The glass partition separating them from Tommy was firmly raised. The silence wasn't the cold, professional distance they had maintained for a month. It was heavy-charged and volatile. The air crackled with the unsaid. Corin stared out the tinted window at the blurring city lights, hyper-aware of the space between them on the leather seat. It was exactly 6 inches. It felt like a canyon. It felt like nothing at all. When the private elevator doors opened into the penthouse, the quiet of the massive apartment hit them like a physical blow. Corinne dropped her small clutch on the console table. She suddenly felt exhausted. The immense weight of the performance crashing down on her shoulders. She reached up, her fingers fumbling with the intricate platinum clasp of the diamond tennis necklace at the nape of her neck. Her hands were shaking slightly. The metal mechanism refused to yield. "Let me," Louis said. He stepped up behind her. He didn't ask for permission. He simply took over, just as he did with everything in his empire. His large, warm fingers brushed against her skin, instantly stilling her trembling hands. The clasp clicked open easily under his dexterity, but instead of pulling the heavy diamonds away, he let them slide slowly down her collarbone, catching the necklace in his palm before it hit the floor. He didn't step back. Corinne remained frozen, staring at their reflection in the dark, unlit glass of the floor-to-ceiling windows. He was so close, she could feel the heat radiating from his chest through his tuxedo shirt. "You were flawless tonight," Louis said quietly to the empty room. "I have a good memory for numbers." She deflected her voice, barely a whisper. "Stop doing that," Louis commanded softly, his hands moving to rest heavily on her bare hips, his thumbs pressing into the silk of her dress. "Stop reducing what you are. You didn't just recite numbers. You dismantled Damien Costa because he threatened what is ours." "Ours?" The word hung in the quiet room, dangerous and absolute. Corinne turned around within the cage of his arms. She tilted her head back to look at him. The mask was gone. The cold, calculating syndicate boss was stripped away, leaving only a man standing at the edge of a cliff, looking down at the only thing that could make him fall. "It's a lie, Louis," Corinne whispered desperately, trying to hold on to reality. "It's a shield. You said it yourself. I'm just wearing the armor you bought me." "Is that what you think?" His jaw clenched, a muscle feathering furiously in his cheek. "You think I moved you into my home, gave you my name, and put 3 carats on your finger just to scare away a pathetic junkie like Palmer? Yes, then you are the smartest woman I know, and simultaneously the most blind." Louis moved fast, his patience entirely shattered. He cupped her face with both hands, his calloused palms rough against her soft skin, and brought his mouth down hard on hers. There was nothing gentle about it. It wasn't a question, it was a conquest. It was 2 years of forced professional distance, a month of agonizing proximity, and the raw territorial violence of the evening, all detonating at once. Corinne gasped against his lips, the shock of it wiring straight to her core. For a fraction of a second, her brain tried to compute the logistical impossibility of kissing her boss. Then she stopped thinking entirely. She answered the kiss with a desperation that matched his own. Her hands tangled in the lapels of his tuxedo, pulling his massive frame closer, erasing the remaining space between them. She tasted the expensive bourbon he had been drinking, mixed with the dark, addictive essence that was entirely him. Louis groaned, a low, guttural sound of surrender. He backed her up, his hands dropping from her face to grip her waist, lifting her effortlessly until her back hit the cool plaster of the hallway wall. Her legs wrapped around his waist, purely on instinct. He kissed her jaw, her neck, burying his face in the curve of her shoulder, inhaling the scent of her skin as if it were oxygen. "You have been driving me out of my mind," he rasped against her skin, his teeth grazing her collarbone. "Sitting across from me every day, sleeping down the hall, letting other men look at you tonight. Louis." She ran her hands through his perfectly styled hair, ruining it, loving the friction of the thick strands against her fingers. He pulled back just enough to look at her. His chest heaved. His eyes were completely black, stripped of all pretense. "Tell me to stop, Corinne. Tell me this is just a transaction, and I will put you down, and I will never touch you again." But if you don't, he trailed off, leaving the threat, the promise hanging heavy in the air between them. Corinne looked at the man holding her against the wall, the man who had broken an abuser's wrist without blinking, the man who owned half the city, but was currently asking her for permission to breathe. The line between fear and desire had blurred weeks ago, and tonight Damien Costa had set the remainder of it on fire. She reached her left hand up the heavy, flawless diamond, catching the dim, ambient light from the city below. She placed her palm flat against his cheek. "I don't want you to stop," she whispered. Louis let out a harsh, jagged breath. He didn't waste another word. He kissed her again, harder this time, completely consuming her. He carried her down the long, dark hallway, past her designated bedroom suite, and kicked open the heavy oak door to the west wing, his wing. The shield had cracked. The lie was dead, and whatever was coming next was entirely, terrifyingly real. Sunlight pierced the gap in the heavy blackout curtains, throwing a harsh, brilliant line of white across the king-size bed. Corinne woke slowly, her muscles heavy, her skin humming with a residual heat that had nothing to do with the summer morning. She wasn't in her own bed. She was buried under a charcoal grey duvet that smelled of sandalwood and expensive laundry detergent. Louis was already awake. He was sitting in a low armchair in the corner of the vast room, wearing a pair of dark sweatpants and nothing else. The morning light caught the intricate, violent ink sprawling across his chest and arms. He held a glass of water, resting it on his knee. His dark eyes locked onto her with an intensity that made her breath hitch all over again. He didn't look like a man who had made a mistake. He looked like a man who had finally claimed his territory. "You're staring," Corinne murmured, her voice husky from sleep. She pulled the duvet up to her collarbone, a sudden foolish flush of modesty washing over her. "I'm observing my investment," Lewis replied, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the quiet room. He set the glass down and stood up, closing the distance to the bed with a predator's grace. He sat on the edge of the mattress, the springs groaning slightly under his immense weight. He reached out, brushing a tangled strand of hair from her cheek. "Do you have regrets, Corinne?" "No." The answer was immediate. It was the truest thing she had said in months. "Good." Lewis leaned down, pressing a firm, lingering kiss to her forehead. "Because the shield is gone, the lie is dead. You are mine now in every sense of the word, and I do not give back what belongs to me." Corinne looked at him, feeling a sudden, fierce rush of affection for this dangerous, complicated man. He had built a fortress around her when she was broken, and instead of keeping her locked in a tower, he had handed her the keys to the armory. Before she could speak, the sharp, jarring ring of a secured cell phone shattered the quiet. It wasn't Louis's personal phone. It was the burner sitting on his nightstand, the line exclusively reserved for syndicate emergencies. Louis' jaw tightened. The softness in his eyes vanished, instantly replaced by the cold, dead obsidian of the boss. He picked up the device. "Speak." Corinne watched him, her heart accelerating as she read the micro-expressions on his face, the tightening of his eyes, the flaring of his nostrils. "Casualties?" Louis asked sharply. He listened for 10 seconds, his knuckles turning white around the plastic casing. "Lock down the perimeter. Move the remaining product to the secondary hold in Queens. If anyone from the Costa family gets within a mile of the new site, put a bullet in their kneecaps. I'll be there in 20. He ended the call, tossing the phone onto the mattress. "What happened?" Corinne sat up, clutching the sheets. "Damien Costa," Louis said, walking rapidly toward his expansive walk-in closet. "He didn't appreciate your financial analysis last night. He hit one of our secondary shipping hubs in Brooklyn at 4 a.m., firebombed 3 transport trucks, and bribed 2 warehouse managers to walk away." Corinne's mind raced. The Brooklyn hub. That was her project. She had spent the last 3 months streamlining its logistics, optimizing the routes to save the syndicate hundreds of thousands of dollars. Damien hadn't just attacked Louis. He had deliberately attacked her work. "He's testing you," Corinne said, throwing the duvet off and stepping onto the cold, hardwood floor. She ignored her nakedness, marching toward the door, connecting to her own suite to grab her clothes. "He knows he can't win a full war against you, so he's trying to provoke a disproportionate response. If you retaliate with violence, the Commission will sanction you." Louis stopped pulling a fresh shirt over his head. He looked at her, entirely unfazed by her nudity, his eyes flashing with dark approval. "He thinks I'm going to send gunmen to his clubs. He wants me to look unstable, like a man thinking with his pride instead of his ledger. He wants to prove that marrying your assistant made you weak." Corinne finished pulling a silk robe tightly around her waist. "We aren't going to let him do that." "We," Louis echoed softly. "Give me 10 minutes, Louis," Corinne said, her eyes flashing with a cold, analytical fury. Tommy left my work laptop in the dining room. "Costa wants to play with shipping routes and ledgers. Fine. I know exactly where his money bleeds." The penthouse dining table was transformed into a war room. Louis stood behind Corinne's chair, his hands resting heavily on her shoulders, anchoring her as her fingers flew across the keyboard. Tommy stood near the kitchen island, heavily armed, and looking entirely bewildered by the fact that the boss's wife was currently executing a hit without a single weapon. Costa uses a shell corporation called Horizon Logistics to clean his port money, Corinne said, her eyes tracking columns of encrypted data scrolling across her screen. I flagged it 3 weeks ago when I was reviewing our own customs bribes. His accounts are heavily leveraged. He relies on a 48-hour cash turnaround to pay his dock workers. He lives paycheck to paycheck, Louis murmured, his thumb stroking the side of her neck. A high-stakes gambler. Exactly. And he just burned through a massive amount of liquid cash to pay off those warehouse managers in Brooklyn. Corinne typed a rapid sequence of commands. I still have the administrative back doors I built when I was auditing our offshore holding companies. Costa uses the same bank in the Cayman payments. He's arrogant. He hasn't updated his routing security in 4 years. Tommy leaned forward, squinting at the screen. What are you doing, Mrs. Butler? I'm locking him out, Corinne said flatly. She hit the enter key with a satisfying, sharp clack. I just triggered a fraud alert on his 3 primary accounts, completely freezing his liquid assets. He won't be able to pay his port officials by noon today. When his shipments arrive from Palermo at 2 p.m., customs will seize them because the bribes won't clear. Louis let out a low, dark laugh. It was a terrifying sound. You're starving him out. By 5 p.m., his own men will be demanding their wages. Corinne continued turning her chair slightly to look up at Louis. He won't be able to pay them. An unfunded boss is a dead boss. He'll be forced to come to you for a loan to save his life. Louis stared down at the woman in his silk robe, her hair messy, her eyes burning with a brilliant, ruthless intellect. She had dismantled a rival syndicate boss before finishing her first cup of coffee. He had thought he was protecting her from the world. He realized now he had simply been waiting for her to conquer it beside him. Tommy, Louis said, not taking his eyes off Corinne. Yeah, boss. Call Damien Costa. Tell him I expect him in my office at 3 p.m. Tell him to bring his checkbook, though it won't do him much good, right away. Tommy practically jogged out of the room, eager to deliver the final blow. The heavy penthouse doors clicked shut, leaving them alone. The frantic energy of the morning settled, leaving behind a thick, charged silence. Louis reached down, gripping the armrests of Corinne's chair. He spun her around completely, pulling her forward until her knees bracketed his hips. He leaned down, his face inches from hers. You are terrifying, Louis whispered, his voice rough with absolute devotion. I learned from the worst. Corinne shot back, a faint smile playing on her lips. She reached up, her fingers tracing the sharp line of his jaw. Dawson used to tell me I was nothing without him, that I was weak. Louis's expression darkened at the mention of the name, but Corinne didn't flinch. He was wrong, she said quietly. I wasn't weak. I was just in the wrong cage. You aren't in a cage anymore, Corinne, Louis said, his hands sliding under the silk robe, his warm palms resting flat against her bare waist. This city is yours. This syndicate is yours. I am yours. He didn't wait for her to agree. He kissed her deeply and completely, sealing the promise into her skin. She kissed him back, the heavy platinum and diamond ring cold against his neck, a permanent reminder of the power they wielded together. Later that afternoon, Damien Costa sat in Lewis's office, sweating through his expensive suit, begging for a loan to stop his own lieutenants from turning on him. Lewis sat behind his mahogany desk, his face carved from stone, and dictated the terms of Costa's absolute surrender. Corinne sat in the leather armchair in the corner of the room, her legs crossed, a tablet resting on her knee. She wore a pristine, sharp white suit, no high-necked blouses, no concealer, just flawless, untouchable armor. When Costa finally signed the territorial concessions over to the Butler family, his hands were shaking. He didn't look at Lewis. He looked at Corinne. He finally understood the fatal error he had made. He had insulted a king, but he had gone to war with a queen. Lewis watched Costa scurry out of the office, broken and humiliated. Then he looked across the room at his wife. "The quarterly reports, Mrs. Butler," Lewis said smoothly, a rare, genuine smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Revenue is looking up." Corinne set her tablet down and stood up, walking slowly toward his desk. "I drafted the greasing protocols for the new port authority, Mr. Butler. I believe we'll have a very profitable year." "I have no doubt," Lewis murmured, pulling her by the hand around the desk right into his lap. He buried his face in her neck, breathing in the scent of vanilla and bergamot, the only peace he had ever known in a life built on violence. The shadows of her past were gone, burned to ash by a man who refused to let her hide. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was reigning. If you loved this intense, high-stakes mafia romance, don't keep it to yourself. Smash that like button to show your support. And share this story with anyone who loves a fiercely protective hero and a brilliant, unstoppable heroine. We bring you gripping, deeply human dramas every single week. So, make sure you hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a chapter. Drop a comment below telling us what you thought of Corinne's ultimate revenge on Costa.